Hey there guys, Spotstowo here. Today what I got for you is a different type of video than I would normally do. This is actually a review of the book Gas Masks, Collector's Guide for Identifying Common American Military Gas Masks by Ruble. If you've been a collector for a while, you've probably heard of this book before and know that it's got a bit of a reputation. However, I'm going to be as fair as I can possibly be to it. So I will start this video out by explaining my potential bias. You see, I actually got this book as a gift from my father when I was fairly new to collecting. I'd only been doing it for like a year and a half. Being a new collector that hadn't really heard of the community yet, I carried this book around with me everywhere. You can see that it's in pretty poor condition, and that's because, like, every day I'd go to high school, this would be in my book bag. So ultimately, I've read and reread this book dozens of times, and I'm quite nostalgic for it. And so even though I still really do love this book, it's my goal today to be honest about it. The last bit of housekeeping that we need to do before we can properly start this video is I just want to explain how this video is gonna go. Firstly, I will talk about what I like, then I will move on to what I dislike, and then I will go on to my final thoughts and whether or not I recommend this book. Getting into it, I will start out with a couple superficial things that you probably won't care about, but I do, and I thought I would mention. Firstly, I think that the cover is very attractive. The red, black, and white is just a lovely combination, and then you've got the Navy Diaphragm Optical Mark I on there, which I think was a perfect choice. Not only is it strange and eye-catching, but the mask is relevant to what the book's about. And the same goes for the back of the book. It also looks really good, and I just love that layout of all of those different mask photos. This is a book about, well, 100 years of history, so it's really fitting that they put a bunch of different masks of a bunch of different eras all over the back there. So yeah, this book is straight up gorgeous. Now, the next thing that's somewhat superficial, but this honestly matters a bit more, is that the binding is a very high quality. You can see that my copy is quite beat up, but that's not the fault of a low quality binding. This is just from me carrying it with me wherever I went for literally years. This is a really sturdy book that isn't just gonna fall apart on you. Anyhow, with that said, why don't we move on to the positive things that actually matter? This book is meant to be a reference guide specifically for brand new collectors. And the book does actually try really hard to be accessible to people who aren't quite experts in this field just yet. The main thing is that it tries to stick to the KISS principle. KISS here being an acronym standing for Keep It Simple, Stupid. And Ruble does make some excellent decisions in compliance with the KISS principle. The first of those choices that I want to talk about is how each of the masks are referred to by their face piece name. Some people might take umbrage with that, but personally I think it's a positive when considering the goal this book is trying to achieve. You see, Ruble could have called the M4 lightweight the M4 10A16 or M4 106, but that might be a little bit confusing to a brand new collector who hasn't really learned all of the filter and carrier designations yet. And let's be real here, if somebody says M4 lightweight instead of M4 10A16, we all know what they're talking about. But yeah, since this is a reference guide, if a brand new collector goes to an antique store and finds an M4 10A16 there, they can just open up this book and go, oh, okay, that's an M4 lightweight. And for a brand new collector, that's kind of all they really need to know. Moving on from that, this book does actually have a section on the very first page of the overview, the goal of which is to standardize the vocabulary used throughout the rest of the book. Here, they've got gas mask, canister, and gas mask bag listed, but at the end of the book, there is an index of various definitions that go in a lot more depth. This is something I really like because there's no reason to confuse a brand new collector by using, synonyms for the same thing just to make the text sound better. In a normal, I guess, like narrative book, using the same word repeatedly within like a paragraph, that makes it sound very clunky, but in an informational book like this, I really like it. I've actually done the same thing in the book that I wrote that isn't released yet. I'm still editing it, technically, on and off. But anyways, I try to use the same words to describe the same things throughout the book, which makes it a really boring read. But it makes more sense because of that. Like I said earlier, this is continued upon on page 243 with this nomenclature section, but this part is reserved for more esoteric terms that aren't exactly necessary to make you aware of right at the start. Unfortunately, though, there are some definitions in here that I disagree with, and the language standardization section at the start isn't always followed. But Ruble still does a fairly good job trying to keep it consistent, so I'll still give him points for that. Next, I want to talk about repetition, because this book is actually pretty repetitive. However, for a reference guide like this, that's actually a good thing. Now, while doing the research for this review, I went and read this in series, right? Just page 1 to page done. And because of that, at first, the repetition actually annoyed me quite a bit. But then I realized, well, that's not exactly fair. You know, this is meant to be a reference guide where you just flip to the section you need when you need it. And because of that, it's actually a good thing that they repeat things. Like, for instance, how each mask section has its own mini-section on anti-dim. All of these anti-dim sections are pretty much identical, which is nice because if you're looking at one specific mask, like this M9, you have all that information just right there, and you don't need to go to any other section of the book for it. Another thing I really like about this book are the photos. They're all very high quality, clear, and detailed. I remember when I first got this book, I would doodle a lot of gas masks, and I would use this book as a reference. That's really all I've got to say on this matter. They're just great. Moving on, we're actually going back to the start of the book. In the overview portion, Ruble sets up a rarity scale that I quite like. It's simple, but still very well thought out, and goes from common to uncommon to scarce to rare, and finally to very rare. This rarity scale is implemented throughout the book. Every mask that has its own section does actually have the rarity listed. And that's pretty handy information to have listed for easy access in a collector's guide. Though I will say that having the rarity printed on the page and unchangeable does lead to some problems. Typically, older masks only get more and more rare, but then sometimes there's just a spring that makes a certain mask just very, very common. For instance, this book was published in 2016, and at the time, the French Arfa, that one, was actually super, super rare. And especially so when it came to the tan ones. So there were people who were spending like $300+ to get their hands on a tan Arfa, which is nowadays just ridiculous. But you see, what happened was the French just surplused a bunch of them, and now they are super, super common. And you know, the opposite can happen too. Masks do just dry up. For instance, the F.A. Hardy & Co. Gem Respirator. I own 3 of the full-face ones and the only half-face one. They used to pop up every now and again, so I would have put them at like scarce or rare perhaps. But now they've completely dried up, and I think it's actually been a year or two since any have even been on the market. So nowadays, I would say that those masks are very rare. But anyways, to summarize this section, I think that having a rarity scale and the rarity of each mask referenced listed is a good feature and useful, for a collector's guide, but it is doomed to become outdated. Next up, we are moving to the end of the book for the Saving History section. This is my favorite part in the entire book. Admittedly, it does feel a little bit out of place for a collector's guide, but I like this section enough to where I don't care. Ruble acquired a named corrected English type box respirator to document for this book, and he actually went and reached out to the family of the soldier that actually used it. The family was nice enough to provide some backstory regarding the original user of the mask, as well as a couple of letters sent by him. As people who are interested in history, it is our duty to preserve the stories of humanity for as long as we possibly can. And this section of this book is an excellent example of that. This is an incredibly obscure story that would have been forgotten by history, but now, since it's published in a book, it has a little bit more time. On the next few pages after that, there is the bibliography. There are a ton of citations in this section, and this is something you just don't see in this community. Like, even I don't cite my sources when I release a video, so actually taking the time to do this is pretty commendable. Unfortunately, it's now time that we move on to the book's drawbacks. And the first thing that concerned me when I was rereading this book for this video was this statement on page Roman numeral 4. It's right here and says, "Neither the author nor the publisher assumes any responsibility for the use, misuse, or the accuracy of the information contained in the publication." And that's kinda strange, right? Like, saying that you don't take responsibility for the accuracy of the information in your history book, that's kinda weird, right? However, that statement makes a lot more sense when you realize that this book is absolutely littered with inaccuracies. In fact, nearly every page that has text on it has at least one inaccuracy. Now, I'm not going to go down the list of just every inaccuracy in this book, but I will provide a couple of examples just to substantiate myself. On page 10, this is the second page of the actual book part, it says, "Canister that is marked M9. One would expect that this canister would be with an M9 gas mask, but it does not. It was used on the M3 lightweight gas mask." You might have noticed the improper grammar in that sentence, but we'll talk about that later and instead focus on the fact that he stated that the M9 canister was used with the M3 lightweight. This, of course, isn't true, as the M3 used the M10 and M10A1 canisters, and in fact he talks about that later in the book. But since, he correctly states that the M3 used the M10 series canisters later in the book, I'm willing to chalk that one up to just a genuine mistake. Here, the corrected English type box respirator is referred to as the corrected English mask. That's not a historically accurate name. Here you can see an E637 misidentified as an M5117. You can tell because the canister is stamped E3 and not M11, and the fasteners on the flap of the carrier are those from the E7 carrier instead of the M7. There are, of course, other examples of Ruble misidentifying masks throughout this book. An example that I remember off the top of my head is that late into the book, an M48 is improperly identified as an M49. Here's another inaccuracy. This one is particularly egregious. In this paragraph here, it says that the twin filter design of the Navy Diaphragm Mark V led to a higher breathing resistance. That's just obviously contrary to reality. And as someone who owns a Navy Diaphragm Mark V and was able to just test this on a whim, yeah, no, that's just obviously wrong. In fact, having two filters makes it easier to breathe. In fact, Ruble even recognizes this later in the book when talking about the M50 JSGPM. He says in this paragraph here that the dual filter system of the M50 JSGPM gives it a lower breathing resistance. And there are so many inaccuracies like this throughout the entire book, ranging from minor to just egregious like this one. This is already a major issue with the book, but this is compounded by the fact that it's meant for beginner collectors, and many of these inaccuracies can really only get noticed by a collector with some experience. So while someone like me who's been collecting for a decade is able to go through this book and decipher what's accurate and what's not, the actual target audience for this book just can't do that. Another thing of note on this topic is that Ruble tends to overgeneralize based on the individual examples that he has access to. So things are included in the book like all Richardson Fleury Cops masks having darker hoses than all corrected English type box respirators. And on top of this, things are left out probably to keep it more simple. You know, it's the KISS principle. And that makes it confusing to new collectors at times. Like when I got my very first corrected English type box respirator, I had no idea what it was because there is no part of this book that says that the angle tube assembly, the XL valve guard, the eyepieces, that those are variable and the hardware itself can actually change. So when I first got that mask, I was flipping through the World War I section trying to identify it, and I just couldn't because I was picking up on hardware differences that Ruble just didn't. Partly because he was overgeneralizing based on the individual masks he had access to, and also to keep it more simple. But anyways, with how much of the information of this book is inaccurate, that means that all of the other information necessarily has to become suspect. And that alone makes this book kind of useless to its target demographic. What good is a guide for brand new collectors if even the accurate information can't be trusted because of how much of it is inaccurate? So while that is my main issue with this book, I do have other issues, so we'll move on. Specifically, what I wanted to talk about next is that this book is full of grammatical issues, typos, spelling errors, and etc. In fact, right here on page 57, he says, even if the gas mask mint unused condition, it still may be brittle and fragile after many years of storage. Not only did he forget a couple of words in that sentence, but he also spelled brittle as bridle. A second example is that for the heading for the M4A1 lightweight mask section, he forgot a space. Ruble spells the term voice-mitter here 3 different ways throughout the book. Here in the nomenclature section on page 243, he spells it correctly, but previously in the book he refers to it as a voice meter, as in a meter. And then elsewhere he refers to it as a voice-mitter. The last of this type of mistake that we're going to talk about relates to his use of Roman numerals. Here on page 30 you can see that he does M9A1 correctly, right? It's M and then Roman numeral for 9 and then A1 with the Arabic numeral for 1. That right there is completely correct. But repeatedly throughout the rest of the book, he messes up and uses M1XA1. So that's M, then the Arabic numeral for 1, and then the Roman numeral for 10, and then A1. Just to drive this home, we can see this again on page 78 in the M3 diaphragm section. Once again, it's M110A1. To summarize this section, I believe that the editing process that this book went through was not sufficient. The final main issue that I wanted to talk about today is this book's price. And to do that, I think I will give a little bit of context. So what this book is a paperback that is full of misinformation and grammatical issues. If I saw this book brand new at a Barnes & Noble's or something, I think the most I would be willing to pay for it is like $16. However, a brand new copy of this book costs $40. Now, for any paperback, $40 is going to be just insane, but for one of this quality, it's just completely unjustifiable. Though admittedly, I do understand why it's so expensive. A lot of these really niche books are more expensive just to make it worth it for the printing company to actually, make them. And from my research, the company Lulu that actually prints off these books seems to be a pretty small press. So what I'm saying here is that while it makes sense that this book is so expensive, it is definitely not worth it. So with all of that out of the way, let's get into whether or not I recommend this book. To me, this book is incredibly interesting. I'm not just interested in history, I am interested in historiography, or the practice of recording history. So books like these, even if they're wildly inaccurate, I love them. I love to have them in the collection. I love to read them. Since I joined the gas mask collecting community, we have gotten so much brand new information, and this book was published in 2016. And so this book is incredibly interesting to me as an artifact of previous versions of this community's historiography. However, nowadays, in the year of our Lord 2024, that's kind of the only value it has to me besides nostalgic value. And I mean, that's because otherwise it's just not suited for what it tries to achieve. This is a guide for beginner collectors that gets a ton of things wrong. And like I said earlier in the video, someone with experience like myself can easily pick out what's accurate and what's inaccurate as they read through it, but a beginner collector isn't going to read the Akron Tissot section of the book and understand why the claim that the Akron Rubber Company manufactured them is wrong. And then there's all of the grammatical errors, misspellings, and typos throughout this book that could have been fixed by proofreading it once, and it's also $40. So to summarize, I love this book and I'm very nostalgic for it, but I cannot recommend it to anybody for any reason unless they can find it for very, very cheap. And that's the end of the video, so we'll go into my usual outro rant. I'll start out by saying that I'm sorry for it being almost 3 full months since the last time I uploaded a full-length video. You see, my last video was an hour long, and then, my computer broke literally the day after I uploaded that to YouTube, so I had to get a new computer, and that took a while. And then, I was like, well, my previous video was an hour long, I deserve kind of a break. And so, it's been kind of months. And then, at the same time, I keep thinking to myself, oh, I should record something. But it's like, I couldn't get back into the swing of it. I couldn't find an idea I was passionate about, so it took me a while. And my quality standards for these videos has just been going up a lot lately. Nowadays, I want to only release videos that I'm passionate about and have enough to say on the topic to make it worth listening to. So ultimately, I'm only going to be talking about things I am qualified to speak about. So you can probably expect in the future more videos like the one I did on the CBRN mask. Probably not that long, though I do have a project that I'm writing a script on that's probably gonna be longer. But the point is that I'm going to be focusing more on super in-depth historical overviews like that video, or general topic discussions like this one. But I've rambled long enough. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you in the next one, whenever that is.